maybe it would be better if we start with little reminders, simply because, as far as, again, I remember, I have diverted somehow from the main topic for a half an hour or so in the last session. So, okay. I said that we are making actually to develop a new conceptualization of consciousness, and we described consciousness or emphasized that aspect of consciousness as an activity of intentionality or intending, right? And actually, this description itself immediately brought into the picture not only of the act, but the very possibility of the act, that for any act of intentionality to be possible, there gotta be, so to speak, an object, a point of reference of the act of intentionality, actually. So this is called the object. So what's at stake here? The act of intentionality on the one hand, and the objects which consciousness intends through that act. Okay, but let's make some things clear before the very beginning. Okay, that act of intentionality, as you can see, actually takes place somewhere in between. Okay, somewhere in between what you may call the real subject, the one or the thing having that consciousness or that conscious state, engaging in that activity on the one hand, okay, and on the other hand, I don't know what you understand by the term, but the so-called real object, okay, if you like, let's be more precise, things in themselves, if you like, okay, so they are excluded. So this happens in between these two, okay? So intentionality never arrives at the things in themselves, in this sense, in the term understood in the Kantian sense, in the sense of the noumena, I mean, okay? But the object I am talking about is therefore always an object for the consciousness, okay? To use a classical terminology, I would call it, for instance, within the Kantian framework, this would nothing else than be the appearance, a phenomenal appearance. But here, the procedure of taking into brackets of any given experience actually enables Husserl to see that object for consciousness as the thing in itself, okay, in this now new sense of the term. Okay, so don't forget, this is all an object always for the consciousness. Okay, it means that without consciousness it does not stand there on the one hand. Okay, but on the other hand, within the structure of an experience taken into brackets, okay, it presents itself as the object itself. Okay, but don't forget, this object is the object of consciousness. Okay. On the other hand of this polarity of the relationship, one hand the object for consciousness, the consciousness therefore can only show itself, okay, as the consciousness of. Okay. So this means that I may intend that desk, I may intend that board marker. Now I am not talking about, we have suspended, you know, all judgments with regard to the experience. So we are taking experience as it is. Actually, this procedure is similar to what Descartes did with his proof with regard to the existence of mind. Okay. you know that story. So I'm not going to repeat it in detail, but you know that regardless of any evil demon, blah blah. Okay, nothing can change the fact that for the time being I'm thinking. Okay, regardless of what I am thinking, regardless of how erroneous I could be in relation to the contents of my thinking, etc., etc. All these other possibilities being considered, that one single fact remains, okay, that I was thinking. Okay, if you apply this to experience, okay, the experience remains as such, okay, regardless of whether what you are experiencing is this or that, regardless of whether you are dreaming rather than actually experiencing this, whatever it is, board marker, okay? Regardless of if you are erroneous, so to come to see a board marker which does not really exist, etc., etc., the experience remains here. The experience of I am seeing this board marker right now, I am holding it in my hands, remains here, okay? This is the meaning of suspending judgments with regard to any possible experience, okay? So this means that actually Husserlian epoche will demand a little bit more than this for you. Actually, it would demand suspending judgment with regard to the totality of the conceived world, that world that we conceive when we assume that natural attitude he was talking about last time. Okay. So I suspend judgment with regard to the existence of the world. I suspend judgment with regard to the truth of the experience. I suspend judgment with regard to this and that. Okay? It means that I'm making no claims with regard to what it is. And what remains behind is nothing else than, according to Husserl, pure experience, and within the analysis of the pure experience, the possibility of elaborating on the structures of pure consciousness. Okay? So experience itself, you know, I'm making no any other claims. I'm only saying that regardless of whether I am dreaming, whether I am in error, or whatever else, okay, my experience is that I am holding this board marker right now in my hand, okay? I may be erroneous, of course, and this could not be a board marker, but I am suspending, refraining judgments from all about this, and I take the experience in its purity, okay? That's what it means to put in brackets or assuming epoche in relation to experience. Okay?
And now why do we call these objects after that they are the objects themselves, or the object itself, if they are the pure objects of consciousness? Or
yeah, what there is a difference here. Think about the Kantian conceptualization of this separation between noumena and phenomena. Actually, what Husserl is saying is this, okay? When we understood consciousness in that fashion, and being loyal in that regard to the Kantian limitation on the grounds of knowledge, okay? Knowledge cannot exceed itself, cannot go beyond the field of possible experience, remember, okay? So it means that it must be kept limited within this field, okay? So this means that if we keep knowledge within this field and do not exceed that barrier separating the phenomenal and the nominal, this means that actually we cannot say anything at all with regard to the what is supposedly nominal. Okay? And I said that when we were discussing Kantian point of view, I said that even the possibility of a noumena's existence, okay, fall outside of the capacity of our knowing. Okay? So we cannot even say that in contrast to the phenomenal, there gotta be a nominal. Okay? Remember, our only reason in thinking that there gotta be a nominal in relation to the phenomenal, if I see certain things, okay, there gotta be certain things causing me to have such vision. Okay, this is, the logic of causation, and we have seen in Kant that causation is one of the categories of the consciousness. Okay, this means that in Kantian terminology, that we must think in that way does not necessarily mean that our thinking finds its corresponding counterpart in the actual reality. Okay? We have necessarily enforced to think in terms of causation here, therefore we produce the notion of the noumena, but as we have seen, noumena means that we necessarily think things that we necessarily think in our thinking to exist. Okay? Noumena does not mean actually in that sense. Or this applies to things in themselves. So the only possibility, or if you like, necessity of thinking about the existence of things in themselves comes from the category of causation, which is a function of our thinking, okay? Not the actual existence of things in themselves, but it has been enforced onto our thinking by certain characteristic of our thinking, the causation, okay? It means that to be able to understand, okay, we necessarily apply certain categories, perhaps, if you like, the most important of which is nothing else than causation. Schopenhauer, for instance, would reduce Kantian 12 categories into one single category of causation. Okay? So it is why we tend to think that there gotta be something else. Don't forget this. Now here, therefore, the whole analysis cannot extend itself beyond the phenomenal. But what happens when you bracket an experience? In other words, suspend any judgments with regard to existence or non-existence or truth or whatever it is, okay, of the experience and its contents, okay? The experience itself and its contents show themselves to the intending consciousness immediately, would say Husserl, okay? Immediately, without any mediation. So it is in that sense, this time he uses thing in itself here, okay? That which shows itself within the structure of experience to the intending consciousness turns out to be the thing in itself, the object for consciousness, if you like, okay? That's the basic. So we can say that it has constituted primarily of two basic components, the acts of intentionality on the one hand, and the objects of intention or objects for consciousness. Therefore, we say that consciousness, actually, an idea borrowed from Brentano, consciousness is always a consciousness of, okay? Consciousness of something, if you like, okay? It can never happen, never come to pass, if you like, that consciousness intending without an object of intentionality, it means, okay? So each and every act of intention necessarily brings into the structure of experience a certain object, it means, okay? This is the thing, actually. This is the thing that gives itself away. Now I'm using an interesting terminology, gives itself away. Sometimes this giving itself away will be considered later on, as we will see, a gift of being, okay? Gives itself away to the intending consciousness, okay? But we gotta be careful. I am not talking about that apple. I am talking about the apple of my attention, okay? Or coffee here, to be correct. Perhaps certain passages, I don't know. Let me check. Okay. Okay, we have talked about epoch adapting, etc., etc. So this means that actually one thing perhaps is worth to add here in this connection. In his quest for precision or a solid ground for an unshakable ground for human knowledge and sciences, okay, what Husserl does is to rediscover a new possibility of objectivity, an absolute possibility of objectivity within the structure of, if you like, absolute subjectivity. Okay? Now, I don't know how convincing this idea was, but as you may know, in social sciences, not only in philosophy, in social sciences, phenomenology increasingly began to attract attention and almost constituted a considerable parts of the efforts put in these fields. Okay, you know, the phenomenological approach. Actually, this practice of epoche, or putting into brackets, is a rather difficult practice. It requires practice. Okay, it's not that easy to suspend judgments about the world, about the experiments, and so. And it drives quite serious effort, requires quite serious effort. Therefore, those perhaps, for those who may not like to engage in such kind of effort, okay, it would forever remain something distant, something ununderstandable, okay? Suspending judgment about the reality of the world that I think I'm living in, and so on. Of course, not only that, but suspending judgment about my own self, okay? And trying to concentrate only on the experience, actually an experience which is nothing other than the pure consciousness at a given moment of its acting, okay? Act of intentionality again, okay? It could be rather difficult and have proven to be difficult, but whatever. So last thing in that regard to be said, what we are seeking is nothing else than an absolute possibility of an absolute objectivity, but alas, within the structure of absolute subjectivity. Okay. Now, you know, remember, the Kantian possibility of establishing a solid ground for our knowledge went through the assumption of the universal structure of consciousness for each and every member of the human species. Okay. After all, with minor changes, we do all share, according to him, out of our nature, the same structure of understanding, being aware. Okay. Here, however, the situation is a little bit different. Now, in Husserlian phenomenology, we no longer think in terms of human here. Okay. We tend to direct our attention directly into the experience, regardless of we are human, regardless of we whatever, etc., etc., regardless of how and what the world is, etc. The experience is there. Okay. It presents itself, it gives itself, okay, to the intending consciousness as an undeniable absolute fact, so to speak, okay? So it is in this absolute facticity of the experience we are going to take a look at what's going on in phenomenology, okay? Actually, for instance, all the talk about, you know, in Turkey, in recent politics, there is much talk about, how can I translate this into English? Actually, image management. Proper translation could be in an image management, but word by word translation could be management of perception and so on. Okay. And implying that what people come to see or experience is different from the reality of the things. This has been already suggested in the conceptualization of false consciousness, you know. Masses or workers adopting the ideology of the ideology, therefore misrepresenting the world to their own themselves, etc. Okay. Now, such an approach brings us to an interesting point with regard to these difficulties. Okay. Yani bu arada Türkçesi algı yönetimiydi terim. Actually, algı translates perception, yani image management could be better. Okay. So what, however, we are concentrating here, if you like, is nothing else than the image. Okay. An image presenting itself into the experience. Okay. That's all we are talking about. We are not referring a further reality than this. Okay. In other words, the experience is itself, in its purity, nothing else than as it comes to my attention. Okay? That's all. So, however, as you can see, we have to... Now, where lies then, we can ask the question, where lies then the possibility of establishing a solid ground that would give us in sciences, for sciences, that would give us as what Husserl calls apodeictic truths. Apodeictic truths are truths arrived at or through demonstration, okay? And their arrival is a necessity of logic, okay? Which means that they are unshakable truths. So what we are seeking after is these truths, okay? Unshakable truths, unquestionable truths, plus demonstrable truths, okay? Demonstrable out of a logical necessity, I mean, okay? So they are not arbitrary truths. What more do you want, actually, for any possible solid ground of the sciences? If we succeed really in this, okay, we would get a very strong grip on knowledge and the question of truth in connection with knowledge, okay? However, forget about the knowledge of the things, or from then on, what we call think, okay, is nothing else than that object for the consciousness giving itself to the intention, okay? Not the other objects, the object which you may think there, standing out there, okay? No, it's not. Fine, then it means that since this appears directly within the structure of the experience whose existence can no longer be denied, okay? It means that we have a possibility of establishing an immediate connection between the object, okay, with the object. Now, in the classical theories of knowledge, knowledge has always been thought in terms of a mediation, okay? It has always been something mediated, two different things establishing a connection with each other through a certain relationship of mediation. Okay? For instance, that mediative factor can be found as light, which is a very general, actually, notion. That's why that certain age has been called enlightenment. Okay? It's through the mediation of the light, you can call it as well, nur. Through the mediation of light, okay, you come to know the things. Okay? Light mediates, make things appear, okay, before the understanding gaze, knowing gaze, and so on. However, here there is no such mediation, okay? Both the act of intentionality and the intended object takes place at the one and single time. Actually, we are separating them for the purposes of analysis. They are one and together. Okay? That's why a consciousness is always of something, and that's why the object is always for the consciousness. Okay? There is no other possibility. Okay? However, this of and for allows us to conduct separate analysis. There are, as you can see, two possibilities. For instance, I'm going to read some sections on this, how Husserl does that. First of all, let's talk about the concept of essence, Husserlian concept of essence. Now, think about consecutive acts of intentionality taking place in sequence through time. Okay? acts of intentionality. Now, in all these different acts of intentionality, assume that the act of intentionality acquires a different quality. Okay? Say, for instance, in the one when I'm looking to my glass of coffee, okay, I am, or the act of intentionality is in the mode of thinking. Okay? Assume that in another act of intentionality, again, intending that glass of coffee, okay, the intentionality is in the mode of remembering. In the mode of loving, in the mode of what? Hating, in the mode of what? Dreaming, good idea. One more. Imagining, perfect, thank you very much. Okay, now as you can imagine, in each and every case, the intentionality has been directed onto this same cup of coffee. Okay? But showing itself, as you can imagine, through its different aspects. Okay? Never remaining the same, but displaying or giving its different aspects away to the intending act. Okay? But however, in all of these experiences, there remains one thing unchanging, okay? That allows you to identify this as the same cup of coffee, same glass of coffee. Here in this case, not a cup, a glass, plastic glass of coffee, okay? Now, what remains this functioning as the basic determinant of that glass of coffee, allowing you to identify each and every time as the same glass of coffee, is understood by Husserl as the essence. Okay? So in this terminology then, essence does not mean something. Essence does not mean something, some quality belonging to an actually existing thing. Okay? Essence means for things of the consciousness, a quality of the things of consciousness, a quality that makes them what they are. Okay? So that a quality which is not separable from the object for consciousness. Okay? So actually, if we can grasp this, we have a proper object, as you can see, a proper object to study on, to conduct our studies on, say, in the field of natural sciences as well as in the field of human sciences. Okay? If you develop a grasp of, if you would be able to develop a grasp of what an essence of thing, a certain thing, but don't forget, in that sense, when we say thing, we are saying things of consciousness, okay? Not the things of the world, okay? Now, you may say that in this absolute subjectivity, okay, yani everyone comes to intent, if you like, let's use the Husserlian language, comes to intent the same glass of coffee differently, and therefore there is the danger that they would develop different notions of essence of that glass of coffee. Okay? Now, you would be right if Husserl in that regard would follow the path developed by consciousness. Kant, Immanuel Kant, I am sorry, okay? Which means I am identifying consciousness with Kant. Okay, this means that, that's why. You know, Kantian consciousness operated through categories. categories were nothing else than logical relations. Which have been elevated to the degree of being absolute. Okay? But you know, since Hegel on, we have seen that these categories themselves, or at least their absolute status, can be subjected to severe critique. And as Hegel shown, actually categories can never be absolute, but rather, therefore, should be interpreted as historical. Now, there's a practical danger in interpreting categories as historical, though. Okay? Our only possibility of assuming the equality of one human being with another human being was to assume that they would share the same structures. Okay? So therefore, we could base, for instance, develop our theory of democracy. We are equal. Okay? Why equal? We are bodily equal. We are equal in powers of physical powers as well as intellectual powers. This means that we do share almost an equal structure of understanding. Therefore, in democracies, we address to the understanding of the people. Okay? However, as you see, if I historicize those categories which ensure that equality of human understanding, okay, it appears that in some societies having different histories, okay, the categories will evolve into another fashion, and in other societies into another fashion. Okay? And if it turns out to be possible, as Hegel did, for instance, to place these different structures of understanding in a historical sequence, what you would get is nothing else than one superiority of a developed consciousness in contrast to the inferiority of an undeveloped, if you like, superiority of the civilized consciousness in contrast to the inferiority of the primitive consciousness. Okay? And out of this ground, you can easily claim that those having primitive structure of consciousness should follow the truth of those having superior structure of consciousness. Yeah? This has already been embedded in Hegelian thinking, you know. When you historicize consciousness, it had its own dangers, and one of the serious dangers of it was this. Therefore, from that moment on, we could begin to talk about the uneven development of different societies, okay, and begin to label some of the societies as undeveloped, underdeveloped, while defining some other societies as developed, and expecting those undeveloped and underdeveloped societies to follow the suit set by the developed societies. Okay? This is, for instance, what lays behind from the early monotheistic theories of modernization, for instance. Okay? Okay, the West heading the way, the rest should follow. Why? Because they are inferior in their structure of understanding. Okay? They do not know what the truth is. Okay? So that was the danger. Therefore, Husserl was not able to follow the Kantian path here, okay? Depending his analysis on the absolute character of the logical categories.
Did Hegel infer this, like they will be civilized and uncivilized?
Yeah, of course. Why not? Why not? The rest would follow the suit of the developed societies. Actually, he presented it as a historical necessity. If not a political necessity, a historical necessity. You know, the Geist directing everyone. It was not one nation, matter of one nation. If one nation shows itself as the best incarnation of that particular Geist, it was still that Geist showing itself in a certain historical moment in the form of a thinking, understanding organization of that particular nation. Okay? So that particular nation turns out to be the best carrier the highest carrier of the Geist in that particular historical moment. So the movement was not the movement of a particular nation. The movement was the movement of the Geist itself, okay? But only at that particular moment, a particular nation, say, for instance, 6,000 BC, it was China. 3,000 BC, it was Egypt, according to Hegel. And 500 BC, it was Greece, okay? And later on, in the early centuries of Anno Domini, AD, okay, it was Rome, okay? And now it was Europe, okay? In the 19th century, at the beginning of 19th century, it was Europe. And better still, it was Prussia itself, okay? Not only Europe, it was Prussia itself, okay? The Geist shows its most developed form in a particular setting, in other words. And this happens to be the German people, if you like. And the German people, therefore, would be understood from that moment on as a people with a destiny. Destiny to carry over the development of the Geist, having a certain destiny, okay? So all these matters, however they seem at the first glance pure matters of thinking, etc., having their really serious political implications at the same time, okay? And this was one of the important political implications, reflecting itself in the academic studies. For a long period of time, people expected that the other nations of the world would follow the suit of modernity developed in the West, okay? This was why, actually, okay? Because Geist evolves in that direction, and as some particular minor backward nation over one corner of the world, you gotta follow it, okay? Without having no option, whether you will it or not. Okay, so that was why Husserl would not be able to follow the Kantian path, okay, and take the categories as the main units of his analysis of the consciousness. Rather, he directs his attention more, as I said, these two components. Now, these, instead of categories, present themselves. These, emerging in the structure of pure experience, actually, present themselves to Husserl's thinking as the possible candidates for the replacement of the idea of logical categories. Somewhere Husserl would say that even logic, I guess in his meditations, when he was elaborating on the Cartesian meditations, okay, his book as well entitled Cartesian Meditations, okay, while criticizing Descartes, on the one hand, he declares that he is a true follower of Descartes himself, but on the other hand, would not commit the errors which has been committed by Cartesian thinking, okay? He enumerates three basic errors in Cartesian thinking. Taking the I of the I think, therefore, for instance, as a substantial existence, okay? And accepting the objects of the thinking of that I as the things in themselves, on the other hand, etc. Okay? So he declares that he would not follow that suit, even though he declares himself a neo-Cartesian, actually, okay? Rather than being a neo-Kantian. Okay, therefore, he does not follow that alternative, but rather concentrate on this. And this gives him first possibility of discerning essence of the things, but never forget, when I try to present Husserlian phenomenology, when I say object, when I say thing, etc., all these terms refer to the content of the act of intentionality, okay? Nothing else. Don't forget this. The essence then, here the idea of essence, that essence of which, of this glass of coffee, as it gives itself away to my intentionality within the structure of the experience, my experiencing of it. Okay. my having an experience of that glass of coffee. Okay. So the essence is there. He also talks about, for instance, the possibility of discerning what he calls the pole of objectivity. Okay, slightly different from, slightly but in important respects, different from his conceptualization of the essence of the things. Okay. Now, this pole of objectivity refers to the total sum, synthetic total sum of all the appearances or givings away of the glass of coffee itself to the experience. Okay? Now, this is not a simple act of collating, putting all these experiences of that glass of coffee together. Okay? Consciousness in its unity always attempts to establish synthesis. Synthesis means bringing together in a rather synthetic way. Actually, I'm doing a kind of tautology here. Okay. In a rather synthetic way, as the components of the one and the same unity, unified thing, I mean, okay, of all these different experiences, bringing together in a rather organic fashion, bringing together in the unity of the oneness of the object, so to speak, all different givings away of that very same object. Okay? Essence is that was which allows consciousness or intentionality to identify one object as the same object, on the one hand. Pole of objectivity, however, is a synthesis. Is a synthesis, not an act of inference. Okay, I'm bringing together all these trees, for instance, and out of their being togetherness, I infer the existence of the forest. No, it does not operate in this way. Okay, it's not an act of inference. It is an act of synthesis, a synthesis which can be found in the very structure of consciousness. You know, that synthesis originally owes itself to the Kantian notion of the unity of apperception. Remember, I slightly touched upon this matter when I asked the question last time to you. What happens? You know, consciousness is nothing else than an act of intentionalities. But what happens? Consciousness suddenly stops intending and restarts intending once again. My question was this: does it really remember at that moment of non-intending when it was not? It did not exist. The problem was that the answer, the only possible answer was that no, it cannot remember. It necessarily skips over the blank and unites the past moment of intending with the present moment of intending and presents itself in the form of a unity. Okay? This unifying activity of consciousness here actually is called as the synthesis. Okay? So what's at stake then is that it's possible to arrive at a certain pole of objectivity with whose identity we can discern, we can decide by making reference to the essence of a thing. Okay? Therefore, we are in that produce the proper objects of our knowledge here, as you can see. Okay? Now, if the essence refers to the essence of the glass of coffee, okay, enabling you to identify each and every glass of coffee, different glass of coffees, as glass of coffees, okay, on the other hand. However, here the pole of objectivity refers to the aspect of one single particular object. Many different singular particular characteristics of that object brought together, in other words. Okay. which gives you a good chance, if you like, okay, if you follow the procedure, which gives you a good chance to describe in detail what that particular object is, as it is, okay? Not as it is, as it appears, but as it is. Remember, the quality of as it is here is restricted into the field of act of intentionality, nowhere else. So it does not refer to an outside of the act of intentionality. Okay? But another important contribution of this view is that regardless of who you are, where you are, what kind of history you have in your past, okay, these structures are always constant. Okay? In other words, a glass of coffee can present itself to any understanding, whatever, okay, to any understanding in definite forms. Okay? This is the meaning of establishing the possibility of absolute objectivity at the heart of absolute subjectivity, actually. Okay? So, regardless of who you are, from which country you come, what kind of history you have, with what logical categories you tend to think. Okay, so as you can see, what's at stake here is something beyond, having the potential of going beyond the limitations of logic. Okay, what we need is no longer logical, rational thinking. What we need simply a purified, bracketed experience. Okay. So this means that, for instance, in all these cases, I am intending house, and house shows itself to me, well, through its different aspects, okay? And through this synthesizing activity of the consciousness, they all come together in an organized houseness, this houseness, okay? This is what we call, or Husserl called, as the pole of objectivity. Okay. F, this is a good, very, very good possibility, actually. This means that regardless of the differences between ourselves, we can all come to agree, okay, what a house is. Okay. And this gives us a very solid object. But the analysis, phenomenological analysis, does not stop there, simply because, as you have said, there is another component of consciousness, the act of intentionality itself. The act of intentionality is an important phenomenon here, simply because, actually, under its own light, we come to see the object, or if you like, in Husserlian terminology, the object comes to give itself to our intention. Okay? So that an analysis of these parts is also required, as you can see, okay? And we find that there are certain definite structures as well, okay? How many more you can count as different modalities of possible intentionalities? Okay? So different modalities of possible intentionalities, though, each and every time, tend to show the object under a certain definite light. Okay? Now, the analysis of the, if you like, object formation, called by Husserl as noematic, or if you like, noematics, a study of the formation of the pole of objectivity, involves noematics. Noematics here means tics referring to the study of, okay, the study of the objects, you know, of consciousness or for consciousness. Noema, you know, nous meaning thinking, okay, so everything takes place within the structure of thinking, okay, so object thinking. Okay.
I was at one moment it's okay that, okay, I understood that part that experience is the crucial factor. But let's say, but we say that it's universal as well. So let's say this is a cup of tea, but the cup of tea was so much different in 300 years ago. There was any, let's say, and there are lots of different cups of tea. So how does these experiences merge together to?
For each of these differences, a new pole of objectivity is produced. Don't worry about it, okay? For each new object giving itself away to intentionality, there's always a possibility. I'm going to talk about the possibilities rather than actualities. Now we are talking about the actualities of intentionality, okay? These are being actualized acts of intention, so to speak. So in each and every case, both modality of intending as well as the object showing itself in this act have already been actualized. When we are going to talk about the possibilities, we start to talk about the question of the Umwelt, the surrounding world, as well as the question of the horizon, which would become an important theme for Heidegger's philosophy as well.
I wouldn't get the phrase that the object gives itself away. If the object constituted actively by the consciousness, how does it give itself away?
Doesn't matter. The fact that it appears in consciousness, okay, that experience may be the result of hallucination, even hallucinations. It is not important. What's important is that objects are there in experience. The experience is there. Okay? This uses Husserl as an undeniable fact. The correlate of which you can find is the undeniable existence of the I think in Descartes. Okay?
There is no essence out of the consciousness.
Actually, and let me say this, Kantian thinking was so powerful, on the one hand, so frustrating, simply because it sets before us the impossibility of knowing the truth of the things. Okay? Yani, you may start to watch it and begin to cry before it. Okay, that impossibility is so radical and so serious. Okay? And the result, the practical result is nothing else than we are bullshitting here. Okay? But the fact remains that those frustrated did always try to find out alternative ways. If one of them is completely ignore the power of the Kantian arguments on the one hand, okay, never take a look at that. Okay? And which, according to Husserl, preferring to delve into the natural attitude means preferring to delve into the natural attitude simply because it is disturbing, you know, and really disturbing. And I don't know. And if you really engage in the process of or the desire to produce knowledge having certain meaning, okay, it's really distressing. Okay? You wouldn't like the consequences. Okay? Or the Hegelian alternative was that, or the others who did follow, did necessarily take a look at what Kant did say and unavoidably began to take his saying seriously, so to speak, tried to find out a solution for the problem. And the solution that came up in the form of taking the notion of reality, real world, etc., okay, outside of the analysis. Simply because, and if you take it seriously, it means practically that you can never reach out to this fact. Okay? So the Hegelian alternative, for instance, as we have seen, identified Geist with thinking and reduced the idea of Kantian consciousness to only a stage at the development of the all-encompassing spirits. All-encompassing spirit is nothing than the togetherness of the all. Okay? Here we have another alternative. Again, assuming the same strategy, okay, excluding the idea of the real world, which is called by, for instance, a Heidegger, the ontic existence, okay, and concentrating on the problem of ontological existence. In other words, the isness of the things, which would become the central theme of Heideggerian thinking. You know, I'm talking about the question of being. Okay? Question of being will present itself within this structure of the act of intentionality, as you can see. Okay? This is why they are called existential philosophy sometimes. Okay? We are talking about the possibility of the existence of things, but existence of things does need a ground. Okay? And that ground here is nothing else than those consecutive acts of intentionalities which present themselves in the form of a synthesis of the unity of consciousness. Çok uzadık. Okay, let's stop here and have a break.